to what he has to say tonight. That's just what's on the screen. We'll just open with a word of prayer. So I'll hand it over to you now, mate.
Very good evening to you all. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts tonight. So tonight we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is a topic that's frequently alluded to in our community in defense of the accuracy of the biblical text. I know that, I myself have often thought of the Dead, sort of been floating around in the back of my mind, that the Dead Sea Scrolls are this sort of ironclad proof of the reliability of Scripture. And I think that's often how it's presented. But sometimes I think they're possibly not understood in quite enough detail to support some of those arguments effectively. So I guess what I'd like to do over tonight and the next session is to try and dig into the Dead Sea Scrolls a bit more closely, try to understand a bit about, I guess, what they indicate and what they don't indicate, so that we can use them more effectively when we're talking about the Bible, when we're studying it, and things like that. So I got interested in this when I was preparing, as I said, the ancient history course at Heritage Lake Macquarie. And from an ancient history perspective, the Dead Sea Scrolls are absolutely fascinating. I mean, for starters, they're simply considered to be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, up there next to Tutankhamun's tomb and the terracotta warriors and all of those sort of very exciting moments in archaeology. And possibly the reason for this is that this is a series of archaeological finds that have tremendous relevance to people today. The tomb of Tutankhamun, as incredible and fabulous as it is, doesn't really impact on people's beliefs and ideologies and things. But the Dead Sea Scrolls actually has the potential to impact on things that people really believe in a deep and spiritual way. So they're considered to be incredibly important for that reason. And prior to finding the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest Hebrew text we possessed of the Old Testament actually came from the Middle Ages around 1000. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls as far as the Bible goes, is it put back our earliest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible 1,000 years or more overnight, which is pretty cool. So let's dig into it. Tonight, we're going to talk kind of about the history of the discovery and study of the scrolls, talk about the composition of them, what kind of things are recorded in them, the writing style and features. And then next time, we'll talk about dating methods, how they date the Dead Sea Scrolls, who wrote the scrolls, which is a very sort of controversial historical question, and kind of the relevance to the first century ecclesia, how they fit into the backdrop of Jesus' ministry and all of that. I originally tried to present this all as one class and it didn't really work, so I split it into two, which is to say that there's plenty of opportunity for discussion and questions, so please chime in at any time if you've got a comment or a question. I'd love to hear from you, especially if you've done any study on this in the past. I'm sort of pretty new to the whole thing, so I'm sure there are others in the room who have things to contribute as well. So what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, according to Willett, and this was sort of my first text I went to, this is the Craigle Pictorial Guide to the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a really good little introduction, covers things in a good amount of detail, so happy to lend that to anyone if anyone's very curious about this topic. This is what he has to say. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a large ancient library of scrolls found in 11 caves near Khirbet Qumran, so that's Arabic for the ruin of Qumran, comprising 12 scrolls along with innumerable fragments of papyrus and parchment. Together, these scrolls and fragments represent more than 800 original documents, mostly written in Hebrew, a smaller number in Aramaic, and a few in ancient Greek. Archaeologists also found scrolls at other sites in the Dead Sea Valley, or Judean desert, places like Masada even, in 6 locations. Together, the scrolls found in these 7 locations, including Qumran, are known as the Judean Desert Scrolls. To visualize what's on that slide there, here's a couple of sample photographs. So there's these very iconic jars that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in. They're very distinctive, quite unusual. And there's a great deal of variety in the preservation of these documents. So you've got, for instance, the great Isaiah scroll there down the bottom, looking really nice and tidy and intact. and you've got other bits that are much more scrappy. In fact, there's sort of an idea that calling them the Dead Sea Scrolls is somewhat misleading, as most of them are more in that condition on the right-hand side. They're still readable using technology, and there's some very clever stuff going on around that, but very few of them actually look like the Great Isaiah Scroll there on the left. Yes, Dead Sea fragments doesn't sound quite as romantic though. So let's talk a bit about context. Here's a map. It's not a very nice looking map. It's just one that I use with my students, which kind of simplifies things. So this is the context, I guess, of the 1st century BC AD kind of thing. So the scrolls were found at Qumran, which is there on the northwest shores of the Dead Sea, not far from Jerusalem, not far from Jericho, sort of a solid day's slog from either. And in the region of Judea. That's not the Roman province. That was a bit bigger. That encompassed a larger area, but that's kind of Judea proper. That's what the Jews would have called Judea. To the north is Samaria. You've got Caesarea there, which is kind of the bastion of Roman power in the region. If ever people in Judea got up to mischief, the Romans could import legions through Caesarea and send them down, as they did, with devastating effect. So that's kind of the geographical context of what we're talking about here. Probably worth noting that it is quite close to Jerusalem, and for that reason, quite close to the Jerusalem temple and all of the Bible study and all of the Bible writing that went on in Jerusalem. Here's some photographs of the site. So you've got there the site of Khirbet Qumran, the ruin, and you've also got in the bottom right there Cave 4, probably the most iconic of the caves that Dead Sea Scrolls are found in. It's the one that everyone sees if they go there, and you don't go in, but you can see it from a distance. And there's sort of discussion over the extent to which the two things are connected, the site there and the caves where the scrolls were found. No scrolls were actually found inside the site. And you can see also on the left-hand side how close it is to the Dead Sea. So all very close by. On the left-hand side. So we've got the Dead Sea over here underneath. Oh, this. I'm not sure. It would possibly be a salt flat where they, harvest salt. All that goes on in a Dead Sea area. It's a good question. I'm not sure. You also see a lot of date farming in that area. Dave, I think I'd better move on. So that's the where. Let's discuss the when. So here's a bit of a timeline of events surrounding the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the whole context of this is kind of the transition of power from the Hasmoneans and the Seleucid Greeks to the Romans. Probably best to add some more things to this timeline to explain a bit more. So in 168 BC, there was the Maccabean revolt. That was from a priestly Jewish family who revolted against the Greek occupiers of the land, who kind of crossed the line in terms of introducing pagan worship. And so they led a massive revolt, a very successful revolt, and started to carve out a bit of a space for themselves in the land of Israel. That sort of culminated in Jonathan Appius becoming the first Hasmonean ruler. And this is something that I knew very little about before looking at Dead Sea Scrolls. I found this very interesting, but there was actually, for a period of time, a Jewish kingdom in Israel after the exile of the Old Testament, but before the New Testament. So the Hasmonean dynasty was a Jewish kingdom that ruled in the land. However, it was kind of a sort of a sad, perverted parody of the kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon and the kingdom of Judah and so forth. They were extremely corrupt. They all hated each other, murdered each other. There was very bitter rivalry going on. And in fact, Jonathan is interesting for the fact that when he became the Hasmonean ruler and declared himself king of Israel, he also took on the high priesthood. he held both the positions of king and high priest at the same time, which was very controversial. He conferred that on his descendants. Now, all of this restlessness and all of the vying between the Hasmoneans and the Greeks, and indeed the Hasmoneans and themselves, culminated in a bit of a power vacuum, which the Romans exploited. So Pompey the Great popped in and conquered the region of what the Romans called Palestine, and so the Roman occupation began. They sort of took advantage of the fact that there was a bit of weakness there after all of the internal struggles. Herod was installed in 37 BC to rule Judea for the Romans. He was an Idumean. He was not Jewish, but he had some sort of Jewish, I guess, background and connections. And he ruled on behalf of the Romans until 4 BC, when Judea came under direct Roman rule. And that's kind of the immediate context into which Jesus was born, was this transition of power where the Romans now ruled the region with an iron fist. At the other end of things, in 68 AD, you've got the first Jewish revolt, which culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And around the same time, the community at Qumran was destroyed. They were also fell victim to the Romans squashing all of the revolts in the region. So yes, fall of Jerusalem was in 70. And so behind the scenes of all of this stuff going on in Israel, you've got this community living in Qumran, who started around 103 BC, finished up around 68 AD as part of that Jewish revolt. And there's discussion over the extent to which they're connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but definitely some level of involvement. So who were they is the question. Well, Josephus, famous Jewish historian writing at the end of the 1st century AD, said that there were 3 main sects of Judaism in the 1st century. He spoke about the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. So let's briefly talk about those guys. So the Sadducees were the priesthood and upper classes. Their name is derived from the name Zadok, who was the high priest in the time of Solomon. And now there's actually a couple of theories around this, but that's probably the most popular one. And since they may even have claimed descendants or ancestry from Zadok, the high priest. Others say that it was based on the Hebrew word Sadek, which means like righteous person. And they rejected the traditions of the fathers and the oral Torah. Roman sympathizers who wished to maintain, and they were Roman sympathizers who wished to maintain this social and political status quo. So the Sadducees actually loved the Romans. The Romans helped them to maintain their grip on power, maintain their grip on the temple. It actually worked really well for them. The Pharisees were a bit different. They were the chief rival of the Sadducees, and they were the most influential and popular of the Jewish parties. And indeed, they were the party that was successful in the end. They were the forebears of rabbinic Judaism or Orthodox Judaism, what exists today. So mainstream Judaism today basically comes from the Pharisees. They're said by Josephus to have numbered about 6,000 during the time of Christ. The name is derived from the Hebrew word kesherim, which means separate. They represented mainly the middle and lower classes, and they accepted the traditions of the fathers, which were non-biblical laws said to have been passed down orally. It's interesting that it says there they represented mainly the middle and lower classes. We tend to think of the Pharisees as being this sort of very elitist group who oppressed the lower classes and, just sort of twisted them and exploited them for all they were worth. And the Pharisees were actually quite popular with the average Jew. The reason for this is that the Pharisees had this version of Judaism which was quite personal. It was all about enforcing religious law in your everyday life and things that you had to do every single day. And so in that way, it was very binding on the individual, whereas the Sadducees had a much more national focus. It was about participating in big feasts and events, those things that the temple controlled and ran, right? So it's interesting that the Pharisees, though they were definitely corrupt and oppressive, and Jesus rightly condemns them for this, they had a weird popularity with the people because their religion was kind of attractive in its sort of box-ticking simplicity. Then we've got the Essenes, who actually don't pop up in the New Testament, but Josephus refers to them. He says that they were 4,000 dissenters from the temple establishment because of its perceived impurity and corruption. So they were kind of opposed to the Sadducees in that way. They lived in small villages where they resided communally, sharing possessions, meals, and an ascetic lifestyle. And they're not mentioned in the New Testament, but they did have a center in Jerusalem and would have doubtless come into regular contact with the early Christian community. So they kind of hover on the fringes of the biblical record, and there's a considerable debate over whether they were the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Historically, that's been the most common explanation, is that they were the writers, and certainly of those three groups, they're the most likely candidates, right? People who would go off away from the city into this isolated location where they would study the scriptures, where they would keep themselves separate from corrupting influences. We will learn more about that next time, though, so we won't go into too much detail on that tonight. Let's talk about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they were discovered in the winter of 1946 to 47. We're not entirely sure when. But basically 7 scrolls were discovered in what became known as Cave 1 by Muhammad Ed-Dib, who was a teenage Bedouin goat herd. There's various stories actually as to how this happened. My favorite one is that he's just sort of making his way along the valley there to amuse himself. He's throwing rocks around, chucking them up trying to get them into the caves up there. And then instead of hearing sort of the clatter of rocks bouncing along other rocks, he hears a smash of it crashing into one of these jars. And when he goes up to investigate, he finds these jars with old text in them, old parchment, all these fragments. And he didn't know what he had found at first, but he knew it was something interesting. And he brought it to his Bedouin community, and they kind of essentially sold it on to other people. Fun fact, by the way, Ed-Dib means the wolf. That was kind of his nickname. So he was sort of like a wolf prowling amongst the rocks out in the desert. So this is what happened. The scrolls were split up. So 3 were sold to Eliezer Sukenik of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and 4 were sold to Mar Samuel of St. Mark's Monastery in Bethlehem. So already there's this split in the scrolls between Judaism and Christianity, which does go on to have a bit of an impact, which is quite interesting. Now, Mar Samuel showed 3 of his scrolls to members of the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem, and they photographed them and studied them and announced the discovery through the Times of London. And Sukenik announced his scrolls around the same time. So 1948 is around the time the world discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, became aware of them, and of course, around the same time, the State of Israel was founded. And this is worth sort of pausing and considering about. The fact that these incredible scriptural documents were found at exactly the right time for the nascent state of Israel to take hold of them, to cherish them, to treasure them, and to determine that they would be kept safe. I think you'd have to agree that this sounds like more than coincidence, right? It's a pretty powerful example of how God worked in the state of Israel.
Why does Samuel only show 3, not all 4?
That's a good question. I didn't even notice that discrepancy. I'll have to come back to that one, Benji. But he did show 3. No, it's good. It's good. So this kind of brings us on to an interesting historical dilemma, which is the fact that there was actually quite a lot of evidence that the Dead Sea Scrolls existed before this time. And again, points to the almost sort of, we'd probably say, miraculous nature of their discovery. For instance, there was a Christian theologian named Origen who claimed that he had read a scroll from a jar from a cave near Jericho. There was Eusebius, who recorded that there was a psalm scroll and other Greek and Hebrew manuscripts in a jar near Jericho during the reign of Caracalla. There was Timothy I of Seleucia in the 9th century, who wrote about the discovery of Jewish writings in a rock dwelling near Jericho. There was, in the late 19th century, in a Cairo synagogue of Jews, they discovered fragments of a Jewish document outlining the organization and ideology of these Jewish sects that lived in isolated camps out in the desert. And yet, no one went looking. There was all of this evidence that somewhere out there, there were these ancient Jewish texts but no one went looking. Willits in the Pictorial Guide has a really good comment. He sums it up like this: the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 perhaps also marks the greatest archaeological and scholarly failure of all time. For centuries, scholars possessed evidence that suggested the presence of ancient biblical scrolls in caves in the Judean desert, but no one set out to find them. Or in meme form, a teenage goat herd was able to find this in a cave with a box of rocks. So let's keep the story going. So the American School of Oriental Research published their 3 scrolls in 1951. And then in 52, Cave 4 was discovered. So a new trail starts there, along with fragments of hundreds of documents. And Cave 4 becomes the most prolific place where they found Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1953, Roland Deveau, a French Catholic, set up an international editorial committee of 8 men to study the fragments found in Cave 4. More on the issues of that in a moment. And in 1954, Mar Samuel sold his 4 scrolls to Yigael Yadin, famous Israeli politician, archaeologist, did some work at Masada, who purchased them on behalf of the state of Israel for $250,000, which sounds like a bargain to me, although inflation probably says otherwise. In fact, they were advertised for sale in the Wall Street Journal in New York. There was an advertisement that said, "The Dead Sea Scrolls for sale, $250,000." And that's how the state of Israel got hold of them. And then in 1955, Sukenik published his Cave 1 scrolls. So those 2 trails meet back up again at the state of Israel. The Hebrew University already had 3. The 4 that were in the Bethlehem Monastery came into possession of the state of Israel. And so they had all 7 of the original scrolls that were found in Cave 1, which are kind of the crown jewels of the collection. Now, regarding Roland Deveau and his editorial committee, who were studying the scrolls from Cave 4, we've got to talk about some mismanagement. Firstly, the initial team was comprised of only 8 men. I mean, think about that in the context of the research that happens today. Like literally only 8 people. You'd have more people than that running a cafe. And it didn't include any Jews or Israelis. So not even any Arab Israelis, like just no one from the area or from that background. The scrolls were promised to academic institutions around the world in exchange for funding. Thankfully, those institutions were later reimbursed. They were literally like, "We'll sell you the Dead Sea Scrolls if you give us enough money to study them in the meantime." The scrolls were held together with sticky tape backing, which caused harmful chemical reactions. The small team of scholars jealously guarded their allocation of scrolls, which basically meant that very little was published for a very long time. And publication was further slowed by their desire to publish complete analyses alongside the scrolls themselves. So they weren't satisfied with just getting the text out there into the public, who could then do their own study and come to their own conclusions. No, they wanted to be in control of what they meant. They had to publish their own explanations alongside everything. And indeed, some team members' political pro-Arab and religious anti-Judaism views meant that they were reluctant to work under the auspices of the Israeli Antiquities Authority. So there was actually some of those tensions going on as well in this team. We should give them some credit, though. They did do some remarkable work in the reconstruction process. They were doing this without the aid of computers and digital technology, and it was an absolutely painstaking task. And some of the stuff they did was really quite ingenious. So this is an example of how they used recurrent damage marks on the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can see this kind of recurring shape here would be an example. And there's sort of other sort of spots and blemishes that these measurements are indicating here on the screen. Basically, what they would do is they would use this along with the mathematical formulae governing a spiral to map out how large the scrolls were and how large the missing spaces were, and that enabled them to reconstruct them. It's a pretty clever process, again, to be able to do this without computers or anything. Just some cold hard maths and very careful measurements. So let's keep going through the story. Yes, go ahead.
From that photo, it looks like they were in like bad condition, were they? Or is that just not a photo?
Yeah. Well, there's a sort of, I mean, it's it's sort of tricky to say. They were in remarkable condition for their age, but they were extremely old. So you would still probably say bad condition in the end. Particularly in cave 4, they were in quite bad condition. The ones in cave 1 were all the good intact ones. In cave 4, they would have sort of been affected by rotting wood, bat guano, all sorts of stuff. So yeah, it's a serious undertaking. Between 1949 and 1962, there were more caves discovered, caves 2, 3, and 5 to 11. Those caves and scrolls were discovered and published. And in 1960, the Jordanian government, interestingly, purchased the fragments from cave 4. That was the ones that the Roland DeVoe's editorial committee was studying, the 8 men, and housed them in the Palestine Archaeological Museum, which is now called the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, which at that stage was not controlled by the state of Israel. But then in 1967, the Six-Day War, the Israeli government took possession of the fragments from cave 4 and housed them in the Shrine of the Book in West Jerusalem. So once again, the Israeli government now has possession of all the scrolls. Then finally, in 1990, they actually got their act together and appointed Emmanuel Tov of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a Jewish man, a Jewish scholar. He was appointed editor-in-chief of the Discoveries of the Judean Desert, which was the official scholarly publication of the scrolls. And he expanded the team to approximately 60 members, which is much better than 8, now including Jewish scholars, and the Israel Antiquities Authority provided oversight. So things actually started happening and being published. In 91, the Huntington Library in California released photographic negatives of all of the scrolls. So now anyone who can read ancient Hebrew can study these, which really starts to speed things up. And then in 2004, the publication of the scrolls in the Discoveries of the Judean Desert was completed. Which is another interesting point about this from a historical perspective. The study of the Dead Sea Scrolls has only really existed since 2004. Like the actual study of what they mean and what the significance of them is. It's actually a very young field of study. It's only been enabled since the full corpus of text has been published. As a little side splat, in 2020, researchers confirmed that the Museum of the Bible's Dead Sea Scrolls, which were all purchased between 2009 and 2014, were forgeries. There have been Dead Sea Scrolls that have popped up on the markets since 2000, but they've all basically been confirmed as forgeries, which is a very interesting study in itself, how they discovered that and how they analyzed that. And then in 2021, just last year, the first new authentic fragments since 1962 were discovered and published. I think they found a fragment of Nahum, maybe Zechariah as well, which is pretty cool. They're still finding bits and pieces. Who knows if they'll find more. That's a good question. I think it might have been a different location. I'll have to get back to you on that one. I think it might have been the Cave of Horrors, Nahal Haver, but I don't know whether that's one of the main caves. So let's talk about the composition of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What actually are they in terms of what is written? How are they divided up? Well, about a quarter of them are what Jews would call the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh, or what we would call the Old Testament. About 200 manuscripts, which contains every book of the modern Hebrew and Protestant Old Testament, except for Esther and Nehemiah. Now, Esther is the one that's most frequently quoted. Everyone will always say the Dead Sea Scrolls contain everything except Esther. Interestingly, they haven't actually found any verses from what we call Nehemiah. Now, the reason that's often not quoted is because in the Jewish Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah is one book, and they found parts of Ezra, so they assumed that that was part of a scroll that also included Nehemiah. But that's worth noting, just as an extra detail. So they actually haven't found any verses from Nehemiah either. Now, about half of the texts are apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, about 400 manuscripts. Now, just in terms of those pieces of terminology, so the apocrypha, the Old Testament apocrypha, that are actually called that, it's kind of a bit of a name for them, a title, are 13 books which are accepted as supplementary to the Old Testament by the Catholic and Orthodox churches. These include things like the books of Maccabees, which talk about that intertestamental history. then you've got the pseudepigrapha, which is a much wider body of ancient Jewish religious writing. There's no fixed number. It's not like there's 13 like there are at the Apocrypha. And of those, only select books are considered sacred by some Eastern Orthodox churches. So they're much more sort of spurious writings. It's probably worth discussing at this point the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I know this is an assumption that I'd made about them in the past, aren't actually evidence for the canon of Scripture in terms of the books of the Old Testament. Sometimes, and I remember saying this myself, I don't know on what basis, but I remember saying, oh, the reason we don't accept the Apocrypha is because it's not in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It actually is. And my nice delineated diagram here is not how the readers would have viewed it either. So I've got a couple of notes, and this is where I can bring in some extra text that I've brought along. I should probably actually bring in the last part of the pie chart first. There's also sectarian manuscripts. So those are things that are unique to the caves. They haven't been found anywhere else. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But what I've got here is some English translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this one is the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, which is basically an attempt to reassemble all of the Hebrew Bible manuscripts into an Old Testament. There's obviously lots of bits missing inside it, but they very cleverly tried to put together as much as possible from what they have in the fragments. They'll sort of start on one fragment and then slip in another and go back to the first one and all sorts of stuff. So that's a very interesting collection. This here, which I actually bought not knowing what it was, is the sectarian manuscripts. This is the unique ones that are only in the Dead Sea caves. So back to that idea of Scripture and the Hebrew Bible and the Apocrypha. This is what the writers of the Dead Sea, or the compilers of the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, had to say. There's indeed persuasive evidence that certain books were considered Scripture, but there's little evidence that people were seriously asking the question yet about the extent or limits of the collection. The crucial question for a Bible or canon: which books are in and which books are outside of this most sacred canon. So the people who collected these Dead Sea Scrolls, there's no indication that they viewed the Apocrypha as being something separate to what we accept as the Old Testament. So we've got to be careful around making claims that that's a reason we don't accept the Apocrypha. There's other reasons, but it's not because the Dead Sea Scrolls don't contain them. Indeed, Willett says many apocryphal and pseudepigraphal texts would have been considered as inspired as the canon accepted by modern Jews. And what we'll go into in a few minutes is that the biblical manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal that in the first century, different Hebrew and Greek scriptures were in circulation. In other words, there was what we call textual fluidity. There were different versions of the same books of the Bible floating around. So that's the Hebrew Bible and the Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. Let's briefly talk about the sectarian manuscripts there. And there's a question mark there because that category in itself is debated. But there's about 200, a quarter of the manuscripts. And they include things like this. There's foundational documents sort of outlining the rules and regulations of a community. There's descriptions of a new temple. There's collections of hymns, a military manual for a final battle between light and darkness, which goes into quite extraordinary detail about how that battle is going to be fought, and interpretations of Old Testament prophecies, and a list of locations of buried treasures, which is pretty cool. In fact, it gets even cooler than that. I decided to focus on this one particularly. This is the copper scroll. It's actually, not only is it a list of buried treasure, it's the only scroll that was not done on papyrus or parchment or something. It's imprinted on copper. And it's a list of locations to bury treasures from Herod's temple. And it's actually like very explicit. It says like, under the corner foundation of this building, 20 shekels of silver. There's a whole list of them. You'll have to have a look after the class. Very interesting. So the temple was held by the Zealots from the commencement of the revolts to its destruction by the Romans. So there's speculation that they may have been the ones to store the copper scroll in Cave 3 in Qumran. And yes, as I'm sure you might be wondering, they did go looking in these locations and no, sadly, no treasure. I mean, the simplest explanation for that is rather tragically, if the Romans captured the people who wrote this, they probably did a pretty good job of torturing the locations out of them. So that's what
So
happened
in
there.
that photograph,
Yeah.
the green things is that the original copper as it was found, and
That's it.
behind is the reconstruction.
That's it. That's a facsimile behind. Yeah. So the green there is that old corroded copper bits and pieces, and this sort of story of how they disassembled that as well is quite fascinating, using very sort of 1960s technology and spin saws, like cutting off these bits of metal. It's kind of freaky to look at, but they did it. So worth as well just being aware of what are called the cataloging conventions of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or Q numbers. So this is how they're cataloged. There's codes that look like this. So 4Q242. So in the red number there is the cave number. So that's cave 4. Q stands for Qumran, which is where the manuscripts are found. They all say Q. And the blue number is the manuscript number, so manuscript 242. You can also have more specific ones where it's not given a manuscript number, instead it's given a letter. So this one's in cave 1. It's a Q for Qumran, and S there stands for Serek, which is Hebrew for order. And this is one of those manuscripts that gives outlines of how to run this community of believers. So that's how they're catalogued. Let's start to look at a bit more of the nitty-gritty of what the scrolls are. Firstly, and this sort of has to do with a lot of ancient texts, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are no exception, there's been some significant changes in formatting over time, just in terms of how the text is presented. So here's an example. You've got up on the top right there, Psalm 1, verses 1 to 3 in its ancient format. There's no verse numbers, there's no vowels, there's no other signs. In a modern Hebrew Bible, in the Masoretic format, you've got the vowel pointings around the letters, all the jots and tittles. You've got verse numbers, you've got marks and accents, all these things that help people to read the text, navigate it. In fact, the translators of this collection here had this to say: the scrolls were written right to left, using no punctuation except for an occasional paragraph indentation, no periods, commas, quotation marks, or any of the other reader helps to which we're so accustomed. Indeed, in some cases, there are not even spaces between words. The letters simply run together in a continuous stream. So there's sort of layers upon layers of difficulty in terms of reading these texts. I mean, I can't even read Hebrew at all. But yeah, it's just mind-boggling to think about the challenges they went through in trying to decipher these documents. There's also a very interesting feature, and that's different forms of ancient Hebrew. So there's two main forms of Hebrew that appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the Jewish script, which was the most common script of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was actually little known before the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it ranges from beautiful conventionalized calligraphic hands, like you've got on the right hand there, very nice and tidy, to very cursive or illegible hands, basically. And one descendant became that's most often used in modern printed Hebrew Bibles and books. So this is the ancestor of modern Hebrew text. There's also, intriguingly, what's called Paleo-Hebrew, which was the standard in the days of David and Solomon on down to the time of Jeremiah. And it's used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially for the Torah and for Job, so for the books of Moses. This is an older form of Hebrew. It's very ancient. And essentially, what they suspect is that when they went back to this older form of Hebrew, it was to try and preserve some of the sacredness of those early texts, sort of suggest that they viewed the books of Moses as very early, very sacred, and they wanted to try and reproduce them in the way that they would have been written down in earlier times. It also indicates that they believed that Job was one of the first books of the Bible, which is quite interesting. It's also used within sections of the Jewish script for the Tetragrammaton, for the Yod-He-Vav-He, or Yahweh. So what you've got there on the right-hand side there is a section from Psalms 124 and 127. As you run your eyes across that line there, even if you're like me and you can't read Hebrew, there's certain characters that kind of pop out as a bit more angular and jagged. And you'll see a little clump of them every now and then. That is the name of God, which is pretty cool, right? So when they went to write the name of God, they actually broke out of the normal script of their day and went back to a more ancient form, again, almost as a sign of respect, perhaps. which is quite intriguing, quite interesting.
What does tetragrammaton?
4 letters. Yeah,
Oh.
4 letters. YHWH. Yeah. So there's a couple of things to note here. So prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was believed that in the 1st century, Hebrew was essentially an academic language, kind of like Latin was in the Middle Ages. That's what was thought, if not dead entirely. And they believed that Aramaic was the vernacular that was almost never used in writing, and Greek was the standard language of literature. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls forced scholars to reevaluate this view. Hebrew was still very much alive. Aramaic was used in writing. And for writing, the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Yahad, generally tried to imitate biblical Hebrew, an older form of the language. The situation would be analogous to our trying to write in the style of Elizabethan English. So when they wrote their own texts, like these ones, they actually tried to imitate this older style of writing. Not all of the scroll writers could perform this feat equally well, so the correctness of the Hebrew varies considerably. And indeed, sometimes when we try to use these and thous and things, we don't quite do it correctly either. Modern scholars actually appreciate the mistakes more than the deft performances, because the mistakes arise from the writer's own language usage, and that teaches us about the spoken language they had. Scholars have actually identified the handwriting of hundreds of different scribes in the Dead Sea Scrolls, with only about a dozen repeats. So this is an interesting thing to keep in mind in terms of that view that there was this little hermit community of sort of monkish Jews writing down the Dead Sea Scrolls. It doesn't quite square with that, because there was actually hundreds of different handwriting styles being used. We would expect, if it was just a small community, that there'd be a limited number of hands and more text traceable to each individual scribe. But there's this big, wide variety, which tends to indicate that these scrolls were actually coming from a few different places. But anyway, we'll discuss that more next time. Now, in terms of studying the scrolls, there's a few challenges. We've already kind of alluded to some of those. So that scroll there is very much an exception. It's very neat and clean. Anyone who could read ancient Hebrew, or probably even modern Hebrew, could muddle their way through that, I assume. But it's not always the case. What we get presented with is gaps in the manuscript, and this is how this Dead Sea Scrolls Bible is formatted. I took these photocopies from there. Those square brackets indicate bits of the text that are missing and have been reconstructed, usually from the Masoretic text or anything else they can get their hands on. Now, I've deliberately chosen these 2 sections because the Micah passage there is mostly intact, whereas the Ezekiel is quite chunky. In fact, here's to make it a bit clearer. Now, if you were given that first chunk, you could probably, after a while, work out where it's from, right? Just from context. I don't know how many of us, if we were given that second chunk, would be able to work out that that was Ezekiel. So that's just an indication of some of the levels of difficulty involved in reassembling some of these texts. There's also, yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Yes.
From the manuscript, or it was just missing the writing itself?
Missing from the preserved manuscript. So this is kind of the difference where I had that introductory slide with the very complete scroll of Isaiah versus those fragmentary texts. Yeah, the Ezekiel there is a whole bunch of little fragments and bits and pieces with whole chunks of paper, like paper parchment, missing. Yeah, whereas the Micah is a bit more intact. There's just little holes and spots and cracks missing. Yeah. No, no, I should have got rid of those as well. Yeah. That would have made things easy. Now this is of course other situations that are even more difficult, which is where it's these unique texts that only occur in Qumran, where we have no idea what the rest of it said because it's missing and we have no other copy of that text. So this is one that I gave to my class at the start of the year, and it's just the middle of a column of text. The bits on the edges are missing. And it's been interpreted as a song of praise. And we actually did an exercise where we tried to fill in the gaps based on passages in Psalms and try to, make something that sounded like a song of praise from the Psalms, because that's what they did, right? They tried to imitate the style of biblical Hebrew. So that's an interesting one. However, and this is an example of some of the controversies and problems that come up, that first word there, Zimrat, which describes the first line, but comprises the first line, is actually the subject of some debate. Some people translate that power or protection rather than song of praise. And that first line basically governs the interpretation of the whole rest of that fragment. If that doesn't say song of praise, well, then the text could be something different entirely. In fact, there's the question, what might it be other than a hymn or a song of praise? If the first line says power or protection, we would assume perhaps some kind of prayer or blessing or something along those lines. But this goes to show that the meaning of a scroll can turn on a very small piece of information. All right. The next thing to talk about is textual variance. So this is where we have got quite an intact scroll, like the Isaiah scroll. In fact, this is from the Great Isaiah Scroll. Sorry, I know it's impossible to read. You're not meant to be able to read it. But we have got all the words, but the words are not the same as what they are in the Masoretic text. In fact, the words, which is what most of our modern translations of the Old Testament are based on. In fact, they're not even the same as some of the other Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is an indication of just the level of variance that are going on. These are all footnotes on that text up there where things are different. They say things like, not in the Masoretic text, different word in the Masoretic text, not in the Masoretic text, etc. Now, let me reassure you that none of these are particularly interesting. They're mostly sort of tiny little grammatical variants and shifts. There's no big issues there. In fact, I've gone through, I haven't read it cover to cover, unfortunately. That'll have to wait for another time. But thankfully, another cool feature of this is that they put a big sort of note every time there's a significant change. And I've looked at all of what they deem the significant changes, and none of them are like sort of smoking guns. It's like, the devil is real. No, it's nothing, super controversial or surprising pops out. But there are textual variants. There's grammatical shifts, there's shifts in name, there's shifts in sense and so forth. There's even actually spelling and grammar mistakes, interestingly. For instance, in Isaiah 49 verse 26, it says there, those who maltreat you, I will make eat their own flesh, and they will be drunk with their own blood as with sweet wine. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls actually misspells it, so that it appears to say, those who mistreat you, I will eat their flesh, which is a slightly more disturbing rendering. So there are actually misspellings and words doubled up. I know sometimes when I'm writing something on the computer, I accidentally type the same word twice. There's lots of that sort of thing that goes on too. So this is all to say that there are textual variants in the text. And I think that these do actually have a bit of significance to our Bible study, and it's worth sort of pausing and considering for a moment the fact that these textual variants exist. Now, I should preface this by saying that I believe that the 66 books of the Bible are the inspired word of God. However, I think we need to have space to have discussions around what that word inspired actually means. Now, for instance, there's one view of inspiration, which is called verbal plenary inspiration. So this is the view that the Bible was literally verbally dictated by God, perhaps even that God sort of took possession of someone, almost like an automatic writing type scenario, and wrote out the words of Scripture, and every word was recorded in this way. That's one view of inspiration. And of course, it could have happened. I wouldn't deny that could have happened, that God could have done that. The issue is, though, when we come to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see that there are so many variants in the language between not just the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text that our King James Version and so forth are based on, but actually between the Dead Sea Scrolls and each other, that even if that were the case and God did literally dictate every word of scripture, it's pretty hard to say that that's what we've got preserved for us. Now, what I would say as a consequence of this is that in terms of our Bible study, perhaps it needs to have a little less emphasis on sort of verse by verse linguistic analysis, you know, taking every single word of that verse and pulling it apart and so forth. And perhaps a little more emphasis on kind of more higher level concepts in terms of top-down view. And we already do this, by the way. Things like narrative and argument structure, types and repetitions, contrasts, audience, applicability, how we can apply these things to our own lives and so forth. Sometimes when we get bogged down in this nitty gritty, and a lot of people will use this justification that, you know, oh, God put that word there for a reason. It's easy to miss the fact that, well, that word might not even be there in the original text. And again, I'm not suggesting there's any significant shift in meaning. I think that the meaning of every book of the Bible has been preserved over time. But every individual word perhaps needs a little closer scrutiny and consideration rather than just accepting that they're sort of, I guess, I don't know, inspired in a plenary fashion, a verbal plenary inspiration fashion.
But what's the difference between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic?
So, and this is worth, it's clarifying a bit further as well. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were composed between about 200 BC and 70 AD. There's a wide variety of texts. As we said, there's about a quarter of them the Hebrew Bible, half of them are Apocrypha, a quarter of them are unique to the community there. The Masoretic text is exclusively the Hebrew Bible. It was written about 800 to 1000 AD. Earliest copies we have are 1000 AD. And it notably includes all of the vowel pointings and markings that
The Masoretic text copying process started before the Dead Sea Scrolls were written.
No, and this is another thing that we need to be careful not to ascribe to the Qumran scribes. Sometimes we make this, now there's the very famous, the Masoretic copying practices, scribal practices are very famous. This idea that they would count up the value of every letter and every particle in a line and put a numerical value to that, and every copyist would have to check that, and they would double check every scroll, that sort of thing. That was going on in sort of the 800s to 1000s AD, and it's a remarkable thing. That was not going on in the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's why you get these sort of double words, spelling mistakes and things. I'm not saying it's rampant, but it does go on.
Dead Sea Scrolls
Significantly.
and based on Dead Sea Scrolls, in that process of duplication, copying, and replication, where did Masoretic Scrolls get their? Where did they start? Yeah,
it's quite messy. So some Dead Sea Scrolls seem to preserve a very similar wording to the Masoretic text, or identical indeed, and that we would assume was passed down through Jewish communities until the Masoretes and so forth. Others are much more similar to things like the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And indeed, there's persuasive evidence in the New Testament that a lot of the apostles quoted from the Septuagint. So yes. Sorry. Go ahead. No. No. Probably never speak to him again.
Terrible question, James, did you have another question?
Well, since Matthew said that,
Only joking.
Okay. So, to me, the third option is that it simply indicates that the system, that this difference indicates that whoever compiled the Dead Sea Scrolls did not use the checking system that the Masoretes did use. And what we don't know, and I do believe is the case, but with only anecdotal support, is that all of the original texts were in fact prepared after that Masoretic Masoretic model process of counting the words. And it simply says, hey, they weren't applying the same checks and balances for this writing. And the writers, the Essenes, if you like, were not the only keepers of the documents, though their documents have been preserved.
Yeah, well, if you've got any sort of texts or references around the use of a numerical system with the original biblical text, sort of, in the times of David and Solomon and prior, yeah, I'd be very interested to see that. Yeah.
So would I.
Yeah. As I said, this idea of sort of verbal plenary inspiration is a little bit shaky on the grounds of this. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I'm saying it's perhaps impractical for the purposes of constant detailed Bible study. Textual variants also in some places suggest that the Septuagint is more accurate than Masoretic text. And also something that's sort of to keep in mind, as this is kind of maybe a practical takeaway, is that one way to approach some of this stuff and simplify it very easily is simply to have a good study Bible on hand. There's loads of these around. The NIV study Bible that Zondervan does is good quality. I often use the New English Translation notes, which you can get for free on your phone. I've got the, what is it called, YouVersion app on this, and then you just open up the NET and it's got all the notes there. And often they'll pick up on those variants and say things like, oh, by the way, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it says this, and it's never something extremely dramatic, but it can shift a bit of the sense or the meaning. And that helps to account for some of those differences. And that's, again, this is something we teach at our seminars. It's about just having some good tools at your disposal and using them consistently. Interestingly, another issue, according to Dead Sea Scrolls Bible translators, is whether or not the Qumran scribes modify the texts they were copying in order to produce distinctive Qumran readings of the biblical text. Kind of like the JWs or the Mormons, kind of twist things a little bit to make it read the way they would like it. The evidence to date suggests that they actually didn't do that. They had their own interpretations, which were quite peculiar in some places, but they wrote those in separate scrolls. As far as the actual biblical text went, they treated it fairly seriously and didn't try to manipulate it. Though there were little mistakes along the way, that wasn't in any way deliberate. So that's worth noting as well. So key points. Very few of the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually intact scrolls, worth keeping in mind. The Dead Sea Scrolls largely support the wording of the Masoretic text, upon which most modern English Bibles are based. It's all there. All the chapters and verses, as far as we found them, is all there with minor variants and so forth, which gives us, pretty tremendous evidence for the reliability of Scripture. This isn't, something that was crafted in the Middle Ages. This is an ancient text. We can clearly see that from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
I know you haven't enjoyed teaching maths, very excited.
Yeah.
But
that's not on the record, by the way. We'll edit that out. Go on.
If you would put percentage on the variance between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text, what percent variance would there be based on everything they've got from the Dead Sea Scrolls, comparing it to the same material in the? It's not, you're saying it's not 100%. Well, what is it?
I'm not qualified to answer that question, but during supper, let's have a look at this, and I'll show you what I mean. And I think it might clear it up a little bit, because when you see the kind of variance, you'll see it's like, oh yeah, it's not a big deal. But there's a little bit of a different feeling or direction to that verse. But in terms of the meaning of that chapter, that's Isaiah 49. It's all there. There's no sort of smoking gun moments of now the whole thing means something different. The canon of Scripture was not fixed at the time of Christ. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not evidence of the validity of the 66 books. Now, I'm not suggesting that, for that reason, that Christ was going to quote from something apocryphal or incorrect. Absolutely, he was working under inspiration and guidance of God, but we've just got to be careful not to use the Dead Sea Scrolls to say that's why we use the 66 books, because the people who compiled the Dead Sea Scrolls accepted other writings as well. Textual variants tend to suggest that that idea of verbal plenary inspiration is untenable or impractical. Whether it happened or not is not really what I'm here to argue. It's just that that doesn't seem to be what's preserved. And textual variants indicate that in some places, Septuagint is more accurate than Masoretic text. So moral of the story, just check a study Bible. They will always point out those little things, those little differences. And of course, you can have other versions of the Bible as well, which you prefer to read, which is a good thing to have. So I think I'll wrap it up there, and we'll talk more over supper and next time.